However, if a manufacturer created an app that took that very same data and started to say things like, well, we're going to estimate your cardiac health. Now that's in the realm of a diagnostic, and FDA would consider that as being a medical device because it's not a chemical process and it's being used for some kind of diagnostic. So this is why it's very different from an engineering perspective, because an engineering perspective, you like to think black and white. Is it a device or not? Well, in the federal US-centric policy, it depends. It's for its intended use.
Okay. And then can you just clarify for us real quick? You talked about these sort of wearable devices, things like we might think of a Fitbit, for example. So how is it then that they become understood as a medical device? Is it an application portion for this, or is it they just put it out there and then the FDA flags it? How do we know if it is or isn't? There's a lot of research going on with wearable health technologies.
Yeah, well, I can give you some examples of clear medical devices, and I can also sort of express a rough calculus. And again, this is not speaking for FDA policy. This is just Kevin Fu speaking as how I think about it. Nothing I say, well, excuse me, FDA has published written guidance documents that will supersede anything I might say. But an example of a clear medical device, Apple, for instance, and other companies have products that are quite publicly known to have gone through a very public process of getting clearance as a medical device. An example would be, if I'm going to use a smartwatch to diagnose certain cardiac arrhythmias, well, that is clearly diagnosis. And so that would go through one of the regulatory pathways. Again, I have a very US-centric view. Every country has a slightly different way of doing things. In the US, there are two major ways to get a medical device onto the market. There's another way called an IDE, but let me stick with other acronyms. There are two ways to get a medical device legally on the market in the US. One is through something called the 510K, and the other is what's known as the PMA, or pre-market approval. The 510K refers to a certain US code, and it's known as a clearance process, pre-market clearance, that tends to be used for most devices. And then the PMA, the pre-market approval, tends to be for much higher risk devices, things like implants, pacemakers, things where if they fail, they are in a life-sustaining function, and there's a much higher level expectation for safety and effectiveness. Also, to be clear, since I know a lot of folks in the academic community work on IoT devices, it's a very different world in the medical versus general IoT. Number one, you actually need permission to market in the US. You don't simply start selling and then later ask the FDA, hey, is that okay if we sell these? No, that's not how it works. With an IoT device, it's a little different, right? You can get your venture capital funding, you go to market, and you're done. Well, you can start selling. But when it's a medical device, the US, you have to get permission first. And so there are these two pathways: pre-market clearance, or the PMA. I'd be glad to go into more detail on that if you'd like. But those are two ways to get a medical device introduced to the US market.
Okay, great. So what are some of the myths or hype surrounding medical devices and their cybersecurity?
So myths and hype. FDA actually has a fact sheet. Actually, let me do, since we have the power of Google, let me pull this up. There are a list of, I would say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 7 questions that come up very often. I'm going to post this in the chat.
Okay.
Just so.
And we have one person who's on a call in with audio. I'm not sure if they're audio only or listening on the screen. Can you just let us know for that person where it is you're linking this to? It's an FDA site.
Yeah, it's an FDA site. And if you were to just Google or Bing or search for FDA cybersecurity fact sheet, this document will come up.
Okay.
It is a one-pager. And it's FDA's way of informing health delivery organizations, in other words, hospitals, as well as medical device manufacturers on what FDA is trying to dispel regarding myths we often hear about come up in conversations, usually conversations between health delivery organizations and manufacturers, where one is explaining to the other what they're allowed to do or not allowed to do. And there's often a lot of miscommunication on that front. So one myth that I hear often, and again, this is a myth. The myth is, oh, we can't provide software updates because that requires FDA effectively like permission. That is a myth. In fact, in most cases, a manufacturer can release a software update without some kind of pre-market review. And more important, manufacturers are expected to keep their medical devices safe and effective, even when new vulnerabilities are being discovered in computer software, even when new incidents are arriving from time to time involving computer security. And so they're expected to provide regular software updates. Now, there is an engineering process. Sometimes this is referred to V&V, verification, validation. There is a very rigorous process in the medical device manufacturing community to ensure that a software update works as intended. But the summary message is manufacturers are expected to provide software updates. And so that's probably the number one myth I hear. But I could go through plenty more, but that's probably the number one.
Great. And maybe some of the myths will pop up then when we get to the audience component here. So how well do you say patients receiving medical devices understand cybersecurity? What's their learning in this case?
Yeah, so I get handwritten letters quite often from patients all the time saying like, "Hey, thank you for working on medical device security. I sent my son to your school, and I'm glad there's someone there teaching this." So there are some patients who are extremely well informed on cybersecurity. There's some patients who even, and this gets into an interesting topic of discussion, there are some patients who actually modify their own medical devices. Now, like all populations, there's going to be variation in knowledge. And so you'll have some patients who have very little understanding of computer security. You'll have some patients who, frankly, might not want to have to think about cybersecurity and would rather just say like, "Hey, doc, could you just make this symptom go away?" And so there's a variety of different beliefs and attitudes. So FDA, though, realizes that patients are an extremely important stakeholder in the medical device security community. In fact, there's something called the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee. It holds these public workshops to bring patient viewpoints on specific topics. So FDA held one of these Patient Engagement Advisory Committee meetings on cybersecurity, and patients came and spoke at the mic and expressed a lot of their feelings and opinions about what they would like to see in medical devices. And so FDA takes all that into account when writing guidance documents, among other things, especially when it comes to, I would say, where we've had quite a bit of engagement would be on the topic of vulnerability disclosure and how to involve patients, because it's very different from, I would say, a general IoT device. Or let's say a security researcher finds a flaw in TLS, I don't know, Heartbleed, something like that. A traditional approach might be you write an academic paper and you publish it, or you publish a security vulnerability report. It's a little bit different in the medical device domain because I think it's really important to be mindful of the impact on patients. So certainly exploit code for a life-sustaining device, in my opinion, would not be advisable because that could easily lead to direct harm to patients. But engaging with manufacturers and the FDA when even a potential vulnerability is found, I would encourage that. And it's very different from 10 years ago, I would say, where there was a much more adversarial relationship between researchers and manufacturers. Today, by and large, most manufacturers welcome vulnerability information. And so patients tend to appreciate when these security vulnerabilities are handled in a sensitive manner. But they also want to be kept informed. So most patients don't want to be kept in the dark if there's a vulnerability in a medical device. But then again, there do exist others who just say, look, I don't want to know what's inside the sausage. Just make sure it's safe and effective, please.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned this opportunity in committee space in which patients can get engaged. And it sounds like this is, sorry about that, at the FDA level. So one of the things, especially that goes on at the iSchool, those that are involved in HCI type of work, a lot of what I'm hearing out of their field talks about how end users are very important to be involved early on in the design process. So to what degree that you're aware, are patients that would be receiving these sorts of devices talking to medical device developers, to manufacturers at the security design stage to have their input? Or is this an area that you don't think that they should engage as much? Is there room for more opportunity? What do you think about where are they in the design process, and where's the FDA when you refer to that, their role to the FDA when you're talking about that committee?
Okay. So there's sort of two different contexts: the committee context and then the medical device design context, which are
Yes.
two very different. So with the committee process, FDA announces in the Federal Register and advertises through its standard federal channels well in advance of these events. So, hey, patients come, we're going to have this time period for public comment. It's sort of similar to there's U.S. law on something called the Federal Committee Advisory Act, and there's a very regimented process of the committee members being able to speak and then being able to solicit general public input. But that's widely advertised, and all patients are welcome. There's also quite a bit of public comment opportunity, written public comment. So whenever the FDA produces a new, what we call a guidance document is effectively telegraphing to the manufacturing community, hey, what are FDA reviewers going to look for during the pre-market clearance and pre-market approval process to put that clearance or approval on the device. And a manufacturer who chooses to follow that guidance will likely have smoother sailing. We will put these draft guidance documents out for public comment, and certainly patients are welcome to respond as well. So their thoughts are included in the FDA's calculus. Traditionally, there will be associations that represent groups. So there are industry associations that, for instance, represent all radiological imaging companies. Just to give you an idea, there are over 5,000 different medical device categories. This is not a small center. There's on the order of, I think it's on the order of 70 billion in domestic product manufacturing and another 70 billion or so in exports around the world from the US. So it's a big market to regulate. So that's one way patients can engage. And I'm sorry, you'll need to repeat the second part of your question.
I was really just more so curious where potential patients are in the security design process. So when they're looking at designing cybersecurity for these devices, do patients get to be in when at the very beginning of the design stage when they're building these things from the ground up or reviewing them from the ground up, or do they come in farther down the design chain?
So that is where there's an interesting. It's kind of like asking the question, so how does a design project get graded at a university? To what degree is the instructor intimately involved with the student team developing a design product as part of like a senior capstone? And it's actually quite similar. I would say the FDA is not prescriptive. It doesn't tell a manufacturer what they need to do. Just like I'm not going to tell a student, what do they need to do to get an A? No, that's not a question I can answer, but we can give you guidelines on what we look for. And so typically the manufacturers will go through their processes and then they'll submit the documentation on their arguing why they've met the expectations of the FDA. It's strictly a paper-based review process, which surprises many people. who are new to the area, there's no concept of submitting a prototype device to the FDA for review, for instance. It's all design documentation, much like a term paper or a design product. Cutting to where patients get involved, it depends on the manufacturer. So in my past life as an individual citizen of the world and as an academic, I would often ask that question to manufacturers, and I get a very varied response. Some of them would say things like, well, that's a great idea to involve patients in early design. And forget about cybersecurity, just in general. I've asked medical device engineers, so how did patients react to your device or design? And they say, well, I've never met one because they're huddled in the laboratory or in their engineering group. I'm not saying all manufacturers are like that, but what I'm saying is it exists that sometimes there are silos where people might not actually get out into the field. So I've always encouraged everyone I've run into, whether it's a student or a newly minted medical device engineer, I say, you need to get into the operating room. You need to get into a hospital. I want you to see how patients interact with the computing systems. So I bring my students regularly to see live surgery. They've been brought in to see GI surgery. They've been brought in to see cardiac surgery where the patient is just slightly sedated, and they're there in full scrubs and being very mindful of the sterile field in order to get a sense of the clinical workflow. And the key part here is the clinical workflow. Because when it comes to computer security, a lot of well-meaning security experts will propose an idea that does not fit the environment of the clinic. So for instance, if somebody just says, oh, you need this two-factor authentication, or, two-factor authentication. Well, have you ever thought that maybe phones are not allowed inside the clinical environment, or maybe that you're wearing gloves that make it very difficult to do any kind of capacitive touch sensing? So the clinical environment is kind of unique, and the general controls that might work for an IT system, like logging in using two-factor authentication for email, is not necessarily going to work for the OT, operational technology environment of the medical device field. It might work fine for a home device that's a little more IT-like, but it's very context sensitive. And so the answer is at the high level, it varies a lot about where the patients are involved from the manufacturer perspective.
So I just asked you some questions that are really at the grassroots level of this, but let's kind of flip it to where we're looking at the top side. How are international standards bodies and regulatory cybersecurity requirements changing global manufacture of medical devices?
So a lot. So it's been about 8 years since FDA published what's called its pre-market guidance document, which is essentially what are the engineering expectations that FDA will look for when a manufacturer intends to market a device? How do you characterize the security risks? What controls are in place? How do you decide which risks are acceptable or unacceptable or conditionally acceptable? So that was the first guidance document. And then over the last 8 years, countries all over the world, dozens, have created their own effectively sort of versions of this guidance document about what they expect manufacturers to do for computer security before they market a device. Naturally, this led to sort of a bunch of different regulatory regimes, which is very frustrating to a manufacturer because then you have to satisfy potentially a dozen different, sometimes conflicting regulatory requirements. So to that end, there is an organization called the IMDRF. This is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And it effectively represents all the FDAs of the world. And so I know personally, I meet on a weekly basis with the IMDRF team. And it's, in my view, one of the outcomes will be more consistency across international borders so that manufacturers can again, have more consistent expectations for how to meet the regulatory bar. Every country is going to have different requirements, but if they can at least agree on the basics and the fundamentals, I think it's going to lead to more certainty in the marketplace, so that manufacturers don't necessarily have to make 50 different versions of their product. I can tell you right now, one of the focus areas for the IMDRF is it has an acronym, so you know it's a real thing. It's called SBOM, Software Bill of Materials. And I can see Shannon has a question about that we'll probably get to later.
Mhm.
But Software Bill of Materials is a huge issue. It's basically the nutrition label for medical device security. And in fact, it's not just about medical devices. You'll hear SBOMs in the context of autonomous vehicles, computers on wheels, right? That's all cars are. Well, what goes into the software soup? We really want to know what's on the inside, what's all the third-party software, so we can better assess the computer security risks. And that has reached the level of international standardization. So wouldn't it be wonderful if a manufacturer could create an SBOM that satisfies every country rather than just the United States? And so IMDRF is working on that.
Thanks for that. Now, when you first started off, you kind of gave us a sales pitch to make sure we've got new talent coming in, that there's plenty of opportunity for work in medical device security. But do you think there's enough cyber talent to advance medical device security needs currently? And in what areas do you think we need to boost our cyber talent for this space?
So the way I characterize the career pipeline issue is with a little bit of calculus. I say D technology, DT, is much bigger than the government sort of agility right now when it comes to computer security. And that means we've got exponentials all over the place. And within the government, maybe we're a constant factor force multiplier. So the kinds of exponentials are things like number of vulnerabilities, degree of connectedness of medical devices, and also the degree of dependence on computer technology for the core safety and effectiveness and function of a medical device. For instance, a big thing that we're seeing now is dependence on the cloud. It used to be cloud was more sort of on the side or informational. Now cloud is quickly becoming an essential component of you can think of it as a medical device system. Medical devices are no longer just objects you hold in your hand, but they're really systems. Getting back to sort of the career pipeline, a challenge I really think that needs to be addressed, not at an individual university level, but more at least a national level, is how to increase the pipeline to produce new talent, new experts who can combine biomedical engineering with computer security. It's a strange field, and I would say we need to have new master's programs stood up. And I think there are a small number of universities that are well poised, I think, to own this space. But it's an incredibly important space, and it's going to affect not only medical devices, but also autonomous vehicles, the Internet of Things on more the consumer side. It's also going to affect space, and I'm not talking office space. I'm talking about space assets like satellites, space stations, deployment to other planets. We need an entire pipeline of a new kind of student who's mastered not only basic software engineering, system engineering, and computer security, sort of risk management and controls, but also understanding the clinical side of, okay, how do we manufacture these things? And that's more that I think can fit into a 4-year undergraduate program. To me, that's going to necessitate at least a master's program. I think we also need to think about some of these topics are so hard, it does warrant, I think, PhD study. But these are papers that are going to be kind of unusual. So I know in my own career, when I was an assistant professor, and I told a colleague, I'm going to dedicate the next 50 years to medical device security. He said, that's a bad idea. You're never going to get tenure. The problems are too hard. And I'm like, yep, I don't care. These are hard problems, and I know nobody else wants to work on them because they're too hard. In fact, I've had people tell me, oh, these problems are too hard. I can't publish enough papers fast enough to meet my promotion and tenure committee desire on bean counting. And I say, well, maybe you should leave that place.
Yeah.
I do think we're going to have a different mindset, not only for student pipeline development, but also for faculty who want to work in this space. There's going to be different measures and metrics, I think, to show impact than counting, Oakland papers or things of that nature. These are the kinds of things that might take, like if you look at a biology study, it could take a year or two with 50 co-authors to get some things done. Yeah, it's going to be much more akin to biomedical engineering than traditional IT only. All I need is a desktop computer and LaTeX to get this done.
Yeah, thanks. So I had a few more questions. I'm going to hold those in reserve so we can make sure we get time to engage with the audience here a little bit and get some of their questions. So please, everyone, post your questions to the Q&A section. I do see one that's in the chat, so we'll make sure we'll get to that one as well. But the first question comes from Shannon and says, Biden put out an executive order last night. How will it affect medical devices, especially with respect to SBOMs?
Yep. So I guess there's no like Oxford Dictionary. I guess most people call it SBOM. Alan Friedman at there's an agency called NTIA, and they're sort of leading sort of the federal across all markets. What is an SBOM? But software bill of material. Okay, again, that is effectively an ingredient list of what's on the inside, so that from a system level you can ascertain sort of a better understanding of what's at risk, and then you can also use these SBOMs to be more effective at addressing post-market problems, like, hey, a security vulnerability came out in this version of the TSL, or excuse me, maybe the OpenSSL code base. Hey, is my medical device affected? Well, wouldn't it be nice if we had an ingredient list so that all manufacturers could very quickly ascertain what's at risk? And so that's not a universal thing right now, and that's something FDA is working on to really get manufacturers to think harder about software bill of materials. So the question was in the context of, for those of you who are kind of on the wonky side, I mean, you're in the DC Beltway, right? So probably, I'm guessing half the people here are wonky. But the White House released last night the long-awaited executive order on cybersecurity. This one is particularly interesting, and I would encourage people to sit down and spend a few hours reading it. It's quite lengthy, and I would also say it's quite techy. So there was definitely a nerd in the room when this executive order is being written, a very good nerd. I always forget if it's nerd or geek. Whatever the more pleasant phrase is what I would assign to it. But it gets into, as Shannon points out, there's an actual line item. I believe it's 4R, I think it might be 4R, 4S. I forget which clause that mentions development of SBOMs, and I believe it assigns to NIST, which is well, I guess it's a conflict of interest since UMD runs the NIST Cybersecurity Center of Excellence out at that facility, right? It assigns to NIST the responsibility for developing a lot of the machinery around SBOMs for the entire country. And it does not directly cite medical devices, but if you look carefully, there's an acronym in there, FCE something. I forget what the acronym is. Federal Civilian Executive Branch agencies, I believe. And well, FDA is one of them. So you can make your own inferences from that, but given FDA's extreme interest in SBOMs to ensure the safety and effectiveness against cybersecurity threats, in combination with this executive order, I think individuals can come to their own conclusions of how that's going to affect FDA's thinking.
Thank you. Rachel asks, how is situational awareness of a security emergency communicated to device wearers? Is that the manufacturer's responsibility or the government agency?
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you say device wearer? Oh, like a
someone who has a device.
Mm-hmm. This is a really interesting topic that I think needs a lot more effort, and it's also a very hard topic. So FDA has, in my view, two sets of guidance documents. One is sort of engineering centric, what you build in, the classic, how do you build security in rather than bolt it on after the fact with good security engineering, harkening back to the 1975 IEEE paper by Salzer and Schroeder and so on. And then you've got this post-market guidance document that talks about how you communicate and share information regarding security vulnerabilities and the slightly more rare, but security incidents. I would say the jury is still out on this one. And so part of the reason why we held a patient engagement advisory committee meeting was to get input from patients on how would you like vulnerabilities to be communicated to you? And one of the challenges is that, well, patients have radically different opinions. So how is it done today? It depends. Some manufacturers will post on their website information about security incidents, and they will, if they're more consumer facing, they might write it more to the patient. But I would say like some manufacturers are really less consumer patient facing and more hospital facing. In fact, most would think of the hospital as their customer as opposed to the patient. So for instance, if you've got radiology equipment, I don't have data to support this assertion, but my assertion would be that probably most patients don't know the name of the manufacturer used in some of the, like their x-rays. So if a patient got a message from a medical device manufacturer saying, hey, our x-ray machine had the following computer security vulnerability, just wanted you to know, I'm not sure if a patient would know what to do with that. But certainly manufacturers are expected to notify on a timely basis the FDA on these kinds of issues, as well as the health delivery organizations who are the customers. There are cases in history where there's still, I think, a lot of discussion. In fact, I was part of an article from the cardiac community on how to communicate a security vulnerability of, say, a pacemaker or defibrillator to patients. And the jury is still out on this one. It's clear that there needs to be communication with patients, and there needs to be communications with health delivery organizations, and there needs to be communication with the physicians who are leading the work in the clinical environment. But these are very different groups of stakeholders. The physicians will typically need to know more clinically relevant things like, is this something that only affects atrial fibrillation, or does it also affect ventricular fibrillation, or does it only affect if you're getting an ablation of some of the cardiac muscle? To a patient, they might want something a little higher level. Sometimes the FDA will issue public what's known as a safety communication. In a more severe case, the FDA might issue what FDA calls a recall. A recall in FDA speak is very different from a recall you might hear from like a consumer. You might hear of recalls like a consumer group saying, oh, you know, the following toy is hazardous, might be swallowed. It's a little different from an FDA recall. So FDA recall has a very specific legal definition. But the recalls, the safety advisories, letters, it's sometimes called a Dear Colleague letter, a letter from a manufacturer directly to a physician or directly to a patient, are all different ways. And it's very context sensitive, is I think all I can say is, and we are mindful of this challenge, and it's a work in progress.
Okay. Real quick to follow up on the answer you provided Shanna earlier, she wanted to know if we could get the reference that FDA mentioned in the executive order in the chat or elsewhere. She's currently looking for it, and thanks for the tip.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think there was a bit flip there. There is not a specific mention of FDA, as far as I'm aware, in the executive order. But if you look closely, there's an acronym. You can just search for it. It's Federal Civilian Executive Branch. So FCEB is the acronym representing all the other agencies in the federal government that might be relevant. And so they only mention a few government agencies specifically in the EO. I believe they specifically mention NIST, CISA, FBI, NSA, and there's probably others in there. Department of Commerce, which holds NIST. But then they use this general acronym. federal civilian executive branch to represent other agencies of relevance.
Okay. So today's theme is sort of socio-technical perspectives, gaps, and opportunities. So if I was just to kind of ask you for an off-the-cuff top list, what would you say is one of the top socio-technical gaps that you see right now, whether it's from the FDA or your work, professorial work? What do you think is one of the biggest socio-technical opportunities? And what social discipline do you think should be getting more involved with our technical colleagues to do more interdisciplinary research?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity to, and some of this is already going on in the academic enterprise, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for partnerships between schools of public health and schools of information and engineering schools, as well as biomedical engineering, because medical devices are, you cannot separate the engineering from healthcare delivery. And healthcare delivery means you got to get into the nitty gritty elements of what does it mean to be in a healthcare environment. Is it the home environment that's extremely uncontrolled, where patients might be plugging who knows what into USB ports on their oxygen delivery systems, or is it in a hospital where they might have 100 of the same product in a slightly more controlled environment, but still not very controlled? I can tell you stories about infusion pumps. There's a culture in some health systems where they don't have enough infusion pumps, to the point where nurses will hoard them and hide them in closets so that they have them when they need them. So there's just strange subculture when it really comes to the nitty-gritty of how do you deliver patient care. And this is why I really encourage engineers to find a way to get into the clinical environment, to shadow a clinician for a day, just to see the problems they encounter. So for socio-technical, this is an aged problem, but it still exists. So in 1995, I might not look old, but I'm old on the inside. In 1995, I was part of a team deploying what was then called paperless medical record systems. It's now become known as electronic health records. But we were one of the first hospitals to deploy this technology. And part of my role was managing the credentials for all the physicians in the hospital. And so this was, almost, more than 25 years ago. And the clinicians had these, at the time, we deployed, we didn't have RFID tags or things like that, or smart cards, but we had little plastic keys. On the inside of the plastic key was a computer chip, and you'd literally take this key, you'd put it into a card reader that was on every single computer at every single nursing workstation, and you twist the key, and then it's connected with a little plastic wire to the waist of the clinician. Every nurse, every clinician had one, and you needed to have this key turned in and plugged in order to access what's known as the chart data, which you can think of as your health record. And so this is where the invention of the spacebar nurse came to materialize. If you're not familiar with this concept, there are some cases in the operating room theater where nurses are told, your job is to hit the spacebar so that when the security notice comes up saying, you're about to be logged out, you're not logged out in the middle of an operation. And then you would have clinicians losing them. You would have them sort of running into each other as they're running around the room with they're tethered to this cord to the computer and twisting. It was total chaos. And this is where I realized that clinical workflow was just so important. And it was something that I think a lot of engineers didn't even realize should have been part of the design requirements. So that's one of the socio-technical parts of just sort of human interaction. And it's very closely related to security and privacy, usable security and privacy. So like the SOUPS community is, I think, really key to medical device security, because I can't think of a domain where the human element and the human factors is more important, unless you're talking about aviation or autonomous vehicles, things of that nature. So anyhow, I just think there's huge opportunities for collaborative teams. There are actually a bunch of universities that bring together medical device manufacturers as sort of visiting fellows, along with biomedical engineers, computer scientists, physicians. They'll form these teams to create new medical devices as part of an academic program. And I think that's one way we can really help with the career development. And again, I think it's a great opportunity space.
Right, thanks. So if you were to be a lawn bearer for the day and could conjure $10 million to improve medical device and health resilience, how would you spend it? This one comes from
Well,
Shannon.
let's see. First, I'd build a really nice wood-fired brick oven and a garden bed because wood prices have gone through the roof because of COVID. But then more seriously, second, I think I would use that as seed funding to help with the career pipelines, frankly, because there's short-term problems and long-term problems. And there's a lot of short-term problems that will involve, I think, buying existing products. But the real problem to me, and I like to think on a 100-year time scale. So I gave a talk at NSF, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, on my 165-year plan for medical device security. And the reason why I called it 160 or so years was hand washing, the concept was effectively introduced in the 1840s to the clinical environment, the idea of sterile technique, wash your hands and patients don't die as often. And still today, those kinds of hazards are the #1 leading cause of death in the hospital, problems with infection control. So I figure if it takes more than 160 years to solve hand washing, we're not going to fix the cybersecurity problem in fewer than 150 years. So I would say what we need to do is invest that in our future, the career pipeline, getting people, I would even argue as early as K to 12, exposed to all the interesting problems of, hey, look, you can actually help people if you learn both software engineering and coding as well as walking the halls of a hospital. I'd love to see high school students shadowing in the clinical environment, but then also getting down into the biomedical, the place where they see all the infusion pumps being cleaned and serviced to understand where tech and people meet together. Because we really don't have enough experts right now. I would say most of the experts are being trained in-house. So at FDA, there's quite a bit of in-house training. I know in medical device manufacturers, they'll often take an expert in medical device design and then sort of upskill them with various training opportunities on computer security. But I would like to see universities taking a much more proactive role in this. And so that's, I think, how I would spend that money. Okay, Sean, I don't know if you're frozen or if I'm frozen.
No. I'm sorry, I may have cut out there for a moment. I'll repeat the question. Rachel is asking a follow-up to some of what you were asking before about the operating room. What did it take to get engineers to finally realize that operational context at the operating room is so important? She's currently struggling with this.
So that's a slightly leading question because it assumes all, I think, engineers have come to that realization. I don't think, I view this as a lifelong challenge of you're always going to have new engineers entering the engineering field. And so we're always going to be having to explain the value of working with patients, observing how patients interact with the device, understanding the system level human factors. This is something that you can't simply write a book and say, go read it. You need to actively, in my view, be asking engineers, so when was the last time you've done your in-service and visited an operating room? I think that's just really important. And so you're going to get a lot of variation, different across different hospitals as well as across different manufacturers. So there's, I wish I could give you a more universal answer, but I think there's a lot of variation.
Now, for those that do want to get more involved with the research in this area, what kind of data sets exist for medical device cybersecurity research?
So data sets for cybersecurity research in medical devices are quite challenging to come by. Even internally within FDA, it can be challenging to come by. So there are public-facing databases within FDA, like one is called MAUDE. If you search for FDA MAUDE, it's a very interesting database of incidents that happen in hospitals regarding patient safety and effectiveness. It's not cybersecurity specific. So you'll learn about like infusion pumps that malfunction and you'll see it's almost like CSI. You'll go through and you'll have this report where the anonymized hospital talks about a particular medical device manufacturer's product and what went wrong, and patient expired, or patient was harmed or burned. So it talks about all those problems. So about 7 years ago, I did an experiment in one of my graduate courses on medical device security, where I had students search the MAUDE database for potential computer security risks, and we found a few. But it was interesting, actually. We found there's a field called security issue, I believe was the name of the field in this public database. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a field for this. So I searched, and there was, I believe, one entry that had this field marked as yes. And I looked at it, and the physician who wrote this report from the hospital had written, this is a security issue. We operated on a patient, and the bone screw became insecure from the bone, and it fell out. And so the security field was accidentally misinterpreted to mean the security of mechanical security between a bone screw and bone, as opposed to an information security and privacy issue. So the data is very challenging to get. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in the academic world to think about hypothetical databases or ways of collecting this information. CISA is a federal agency, and I don't speak for CISA, but CISA is within the Department of Homeland Security, and you can kind of think of them as like the EMTs for computer security. So there's a problem of national infrastructure and it's cyber related. Okay, call in CISA. But they have databases of vulnerabilities and sort of edited reports from the manufacturer on what to do about it, how to remediate. So you will see some things there, and you will occasionally see CISA reports on medical devices. It's pretty common because medical devices are just computers, and they include a lot of third-party software. You'll find a lot with Windows. We're seeing less and less Windows 95, at least. But you'll see a lot of Windows 7 unpatched out there. That's in my view, that's got to change. But it would be great to have more databases and information about not just near misses, but also vulnerabilities and incidents to get a better sense of how things are going. There are information sharing organizations today, quite a few actually. And it's sort of a membership model. Typically, a hospital will join a bunch of different information security organizations that tends to result in just a lot of email and sometimes a lot of duplicated email, but things about, oh, here's an advisory about this particular manufacturer who has this security issue. Be aware if patches should be applied. It's sort of a typical announcement. Some of these are closely held. You might need to prove sort of a need to know. Sometimes they use the acronym Traffic Light Protocol, TLP, and they have a color assigned to whether it's publicly available information or if it's something only that ought to be shared with hospitals. So sometimes that information isn't completely open.
Okay, thanks. And for those that might not be up on their government alphabet soup, CISA is SICA. That's a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency. Always trips me up because they have security in there twice. But yes. So Shannon asks, do you think the pipeline shut down? And actually, Shannon, we may have to bench this because we're running out of time unless you want to answer this real quickly, Kevin. Do you think the pipeline shutdown and today's gas shortages will impact medical device cybersecurity? And if I could maybe expand that just a little bit to say, hacking's a thing, it's going to happen. We might guess it does or will eventually happen with implanted medical devices and whatnot. So how can we change to science-based cybersecurity in the community or make it better if we're already working on it?
So yeah, that's a long question. I have an entire slide deck on how to bring better science to the calculus. And a lot of that has to do with threat modeling and moving away from gut judgment, like, well, we've never been hacked or put this on a secure network, and moving much toward a a model that you'll hear about in an engineering course, like, well, we assume the adversary has the ability to alter, drop, and duplicate packets, completely control the network. Now tell us about your medical device. So that's the science side. Regarding the gas pipeline, oh yeah, I mean, it's sort of preaching to the choir. Yeah, what do you know? It happened. I'm surprised it took so long for a ransomware to cause an outage like this, and I think it's likely going to be increasing. I only hope that we can get the career pipeline going exponentially, because the problems are going to be increasing exponentially, and we seem to have a constant number of people working on defending.
Mhm. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kevin Fu. And everybody would like to thank Kevin Fu, the iSchool and whatnot, for having you here. He was the last of our socio-technical speaker series for this academic year. We hope to resume in the fall, so stay tuned at our website, go.umd.edu/STC. And over the summer, I coordinate a socio-technical cybersecurity reading group. And so if you're interested in that, check out our website, stay tuned over the next few weeks. And we'll hope to see you all again soon. Those of you that will be joining to the small group chat, we'll see you there in just a minute. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Terrapins.